So now we're moving into our discussion of colonial Africa. We're not always going to have a colonial discussion, but here obviously it's very necessary for us to discuss colonialism. One of the first terms I always make sure you understand in reference to colonialism is the word diaspora or diaspora. You might also hear it pronounced. Diaspora seems to be the one people are kind of hitting on and landing on more recently. It's from a Greek word, or Greek phrasing of a scattering or a sowing of seeds. This idea of scattering, right, something to the wind. And today we use it as a term referring to people who are forced to leave their homeland. So during the time of slavery, right, we would say that the African slave trade created a diasporic community, right, or a situation where people were scattered, right, from the continent of Africa to various other locations. This was a forced movement. Today, you may hear it used as applied to a chosen movement, right? Something that people choose to do. So people will talk about, I left, London, right? I left Britain and I chose to go to China. And then later I ended up in Africa. And they'd say that, they live a very diasporic life, right? That they kind of become a mix of all these different cultures. I think it's a very contemporary thing to consider today, that people are becoming more and more of a mix of cultures by their own choice, rather than staying static and still. Really within the last 50 years, this has really ramped up. Before that, people usually pretty much stayed where they were born or somewhere close by. Today, we see a lot more chosen movement. So I think understanding this term is very important for being a contemporary person living today. Now, to discuss slavery in relationship to Africa, what I've chosen to do is to look at the other side, where Europeans are representing Africans. We've talked a lot about historic objects, and I wanted to go ahead and sort of kind of flip in the other direction and use this conversation to talk more about how were Europeans imaging slavery, right? How are they trying to justify it? How are they trying to condemn it, right? What were they doing with the problem of slavery? We find that most artists were anti-slavery. They were abolitionists. They were very much against slavery and used a lot of their artworks and their public writings to speak about this. So for my people, the art historian people, I'm proud to say that they are very much anti-slavery and represent that in their thoughts and in their artworks as well. So again, I take this tact to present these pieces and talk a little bit about the problem of slavery. The first one I always show you is a work by J.M.W. Turner called The Slave Ship. Now, if you take my Art History 2 class, we talk about this work in the context of Romanticism. And Romanticism is all about high emotion. It's all about how you can use artwork to make people feel very emotional and very overwrought. I compare romantic artworks to like kicking somebody in the stomach, It's a sharp kick to the groin, kind of thing. It's supposed to be startling, kind of you lose your breath. That's how I sort of describe Romanticism to my students. It's about emotion. It's not about hearts and flowers and candy. That's not what romantic means. It means emotional reaction. And Turner was famous for his seascapes or his sea pieces, and he had this very painterly style that you see here, which is very messy brush strokes. It can be very hard to see what's going on in the painting. Most of his works weren't very political in nature, but The Slave Ship was. And we believe very strongly that it was his way of trying to have an abolitionist statement or an anti-slavery statement as a European. Turner was British, so obviously his people were very much, involved in the slave trade. And what he did with this piece is try to expose and condemn what was going on with the slave trade. This painting is actually based on a real story where someone was given commission of a slave ship almost like as a reward for being, for nepotism, being related to the right people, but knew nothing about how to captain a ship. When he was returning from Africa, a lot of the slaves were dying from sickness. And the insurance policies at this time that covered slaves basically said if slaves died from illness, you could not recoup your investment. If they died in a natural disaster of some kind, you could. This is horrifying to consider, but this is how the legal language of the paperwork read. So what this captain supposedly did is he steered the ship into a very bad, violent storm and then threw the 6 slaves overboard, thinking that nobody would find out about this. He'd be golden. He would just go upon his merry way and collect his insurance. Well, of course, someone always finds out these kind of things. And it started to hit the papers and be very much a nasty little incident in the press. And so then Turner kind of latched onto this and painted the painting as what he said was a way to kind of expose the way that people were treating slaves, right? And how it was this disgusting, sort of action, this disgusting event that he wanted to bring to the forefront of people's attention. Because people at this time, for entertainment, they often went to what we call the salons. They'd go to the salons and they would see paintings, and that was part of their entertainment. So we might say, well, how would this have a lot of impact? But for the people of this time, looking at 1800s, they would go out to these salons and they'd see these paintings. So they'd see this and be like, what the heck is this painting about? You'll notice in the right-hand bottom corner, you can see the legs still shackled together. You can see the fish kind of attacking the bodies as they sink into the surf. I gave you my quote about why slavery, right? And how did it work? It happened because people would turn people into animals in their minds or property in their mind. I would say man cannot dominate another human being unless they see them as less than human. So a lot of times I think people struggle with, like, how did slavery happen or work? It's because people turned off their humanity, essentially, and they said, I don't see this person as a real person. I see them as my property. And again, I think Turner wanted to expose that vileness. How can someone think this way? And wanted it to be something that people could look at critically and think, well, where do I stand on this, right? Another piece I like showing you to think about how Europeans were kind of, these artists were fighting back against slavery or making statements against slavery, is Manet's Olympia. And Manet was a realist artist. And the realist artists were known for just what it sounds like, being real. They came right after the Romantics and they said, emotion isn't artwork. Because I always say my quote for Romanticism is, like, we don't think, we feel. And I always say realism is the opposite. Realism is like, what is really real? There's a famous quote by Courbet, another realist artist, that says, show me an angel and I'll paint you one. Because who's seen an angel? You have to believe that on faith. So realists said, we don't believe things on faith, we believe things we can see. So this is a famous work that Manet did that exposed, as he put it, the 2 animalistic institutions of Europe. Prostitution and slavery. I'm not going to get into the prostitution angle of the painting. Take Art History 2, I'll be happy to tell you about it there. But I wanted to focus on this idea of including the maid, the black maid, as a way of Manet kind of forcing you to look at something and say, why is this happening in our society? Why is this occurring? Prostitution was a big problem for them. It was spreading disease. And so Manet said, these 2 things are both animalistic. Buying sex, that's animalistic. Making people into property that you buy and sell for sex. Making people into property you buy to serve you. Like, that's not okay either. And so, in a sense, this is a very famous work, on one level to look at the prostitution angle, but I would say that people shouldn't overlook his feelings on slavery in this piece as well. And then finally, Pablo Picasso, who gets a bad rap for his attitude towards women, but was a very, very staunch abolitionist, was a very staunch, anti-slavery proponent. You can read his papers. He talks, a lot about it. He was published in the newspapers kind of condemning slavery. So he uses a lot of his pull as an artist to say this is not right. In this work, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which means the women of Avignon, most people talk about it, like in my art history too, we talk about it as the first Cubist work. We talk about it in reference to prostitution, and the idea of representation of simultaneous time. But I also want to show to you here to talk about the African masks that you can see in the work, and then even the stance of the woman on the left that looks very Egyptian. So Picasso was very famous for using what they were calling primitivism at the end of the 1800s into the early 1900s, as colonialism was finally kind of being purged out of the European system. But they were, when they said primitivism, they were talking about using non-Western source material. So kind of the foundation of our class. So African masks, Egyptian statuary, even though funny enough, Egyptian art is considered Western. But, this was something that he was praised for. Today, obviously, I think we'd reject primitivism as a title. It's not the most, correct term, I would say. But you get the point of what was going on here. Picasso actually visited the Museum of Man, or the Musée de l'Homme in Paris quite frequently. And it was a repository of things that the French had taken as they were colonizing places. And he said, I wanted to think about these objects not as something that colonists were putting power over, but like, how could I put them in artwork and give them their own power back? How can I show them as something that should be celebrated, not just owned by another culture? So, again, I try to kind of use the European lens, looking backward into Africa, to think a little bit about colonialism and how it impacted, right, the kind of art we see in Europe as Europeans were very deeply embedded in the colonialist process. Finally, in our next video, we're going to talk about contemporary African art. As I've mentioned before, I'm a contemporary art historian by trade. So this is always one of my favorite things in the class to do, is talk about contemporary artists and what they're creating today.